Right, so I think we're good to go. Welcome everyone and good morning to this session called No Defense Readiness Without Climate Readiness. I'm super happy to be in this room with fantastic speakers, but also a fantastic audience who I'm sure can also bring a lot to our conversation. We heard the State Secretary this morning in his introductory speech saying climate change is national defense and national security. And I think to many this is an obvious truth, but I'm really particularly happy that we can bring a defense session to the Berlin Climate and Security Conference. My name is Ronja Scheler. I'm working at the German Ministry of Defense in charge of the climate and defense portfolio, and I will guide us through this debate this morning. I think it is pretty obvious. If you opened a newspaper this morning, you may have read more about security and defense than about climate action, because especially in Europe, defense is really high on the agenda. The war in Ukraine has really brought back this dark reality that defense and deterrence is apparently extremely important to our security. But of course, we cannot pursue defense readiness without talking about the big challenge to humanity, climate change. And what I want to do in this session is to really move beyond this understanding of climate change being a threat multiplier, adding to very complex conflicts and challenges anyway, but rather look at the very direct impacts on defense, on armed forces across the globe, and the interaction between the two scenes. Because I would argue a failure to adapt armed forces to a changing climate will really undermine their operational effectiveness. And just to give you a bit of a flavor, some examples of how these interactions work. We could ask questions like, is the equipment we're procuring for armed forces fit to extreme weather or resilient to extreme weather? We could ask, are our personnel trained to operate in a climate-altered world, in new settings, in new circumstances? Are the climate projections informing our strategic planning for the times ahead? And if that's not the case, how can we make that happen? How can we make sure that these developments infuse military thinking? And I think we have gathered here representatives from international organizations, from the EU, from NATO, and I think both organizations really recognize this link. When it comes to NATO, the impact of climate change on allied security was recognized over 15 years ago, and it has informed a lot of strategy papers ever since. And in the EU, it was perhaps sort of in writing a bit later to the party, but a real milestone, a joint communication from 2023 really spoke to this link of climate change, security and defense. The strategic compass of 22 mentions it, so we have an awareness. But I guess it's fair to say that from awareness to practice, so how is it really informed our defense policies, is still a bit of a gap to cover. And this is what we will tackle today. So how do we move from policy to practice? How do we move from awareness to implementation? And in the end, how can we make European armies both defense ready and climate resilient at the same time? How do these things together? That's what we will discuss today, and I won't do that on my own, of course, but together with these people here with me on the panel. I'm super excited that you joined me. I'll do a very brief intro round, and then we can start right away. So to my right, there is Tony Agota, who you, or I guess all of you already heard in the introductory panel this morning. He is, I hope I can say that, the Mr. Climate of the EU's external...
That's External Action Service, yes.
External Action Service.
Commissioner Hoekstra and Ribeira, they're the big...
Okay, I don't want to sort of get you into institutional troubles, but so let's talk about the EAS, but you're the EU's Special Envoy for Climate and Environment, so making sure to streamline climate consideration into the EU's foreign policy or external action. To my left, Mathieu Bussière, he's the director of the NATO Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence, called CASCO, based in Montreal, and it seeks to translate climate science into security and defense practice. And you can share from that angle. Mona Köhler-Schindler is one of the persons making climate resilience happen within NATO. She's a policy officer in the NATO IMS, the International Military Staff, that is the executive body of the military committee there. And on the very right, last but certainly not least, Patrick Laurent. He's a civil engineer dealing with logistical realities of a changing climate in the defense setting. And as you can see, he's a member of the armed forces. He's a lieutenant colonel of the French army, currently serving as an action officer in the logistics team of the EU military staff, and can share his experiences and insights from that. So I'm very excited to hear all of your perspectives. I hope you are too, and look forward to our discussion. And just a few housekeeping remarks before. We will have a bit of a back and forth here on the panel for about 40 minutes, and then I'll open it to the floor. So get your questions ready. I hope we can make this as interactive as we can. And I know there are other experts within this room, so feel free to also share your insights. And what I want us to do in the first round of questions is to take a bit of the bird's eye view and look at the kind of the political situation at the moment. I spoke about heavy investments in defense and this like also political focus, at least in Europe. And I'm aware that this is a bit of a Euro or transatlantic focused idea, but defense is at the forefront. And I want to start with you, Tony, as the EU special envoy. You see what's going on in the defense field with the Readiness 2030 and a lot of impetus on that side. You're the climate special envoy. The Green Deal was mentioned, very big success. But how do we merge these two agendas? How do you look at what's going on the security and defense side from the climate perspective? Maybe you can share a flavor of this with us.
Thank you very much. Is this Chatham House or not?
It is not. We're on live stream.
Good. Oh, that's exactly what I wanted. No, but seriously, thank you very much, and in a very strong panel. I mean, I joked in Montreal with Mathieu. Then I had a polka dot tie. I said, I have polka dots, but this man has stars and stripes, so you could trust him and not the formal tree hugger in chief. No, but seriously. I'm not going to repeat what I said this morning, but just a few things that I think are important. We're in a paradigm shift. But this paradigm shift does not go by itself. So this morning I spoke about traditional thinking and silos, like climate action, oh yeah, that's protecting the planet, I like that. And then industry policy, oh, that's economy, I like that. And then defense is for borders. And we need to break through that shift. What I also said this morning, there in the headlines of the media around the world, climate, because that's also how media works, right? You look for a hero, a villain, a winner, a loser, and every day is like a new Iliad or a new Odyssey, right? And the next day there's new copy for a new article to click. But we're in this for decades. We're building for decades, beyond electoral cycles. So if you go below that the political or the media noise, if you look on the ground what we're doing in the EU, as I said this morning, we're actually making this transition. And the EU will not return to an expensive and erratic fossil-fueled economy. It's not happening. Why is it not happening? Because economically it does not make sense. And for geopolitical and energy independence reason, it also doesn't make sense. We've got that message. But now the question is how to connect those dots. Now, in 2023, we had the joint communication. I'm very proud that we managed to do it, but the premise of that joint communication was to connect not only what the military did, and Mathieu and Lieutenant Colonel Laurent will testify to this, and I'm sure Monica was? Mona. Also, the military, I thought, had already got this earlier on because they see very clearly what it means to their infrastructure resilience, what it means to their operational capabilities in the battlefield. But it's important that where we have DG INTPA, who does the Global Gateway, which is a lot of money and is all over the world, they are doing stuff that is in that realm of climate and security. Maybe they don't call it always that, but they're doing that. Then we have DG ECHO, our humanitarian people, which is another group of people who come in to help when there's a crisis and an emergency. Great job. Then we have DG Klima, we have DG Environment, we have our Joint Research Center, we have our Satellite Center, and then we have the EU military staff and military committee. So the premise of that joint communication was and is, how do we make sure that we connect these dots better so that the information that our Satellite Center has and our Joint Research Center, the data that we give, is translated into digestible, policy actionable products which our policymakers then can use and embed in their policies. So I'm not saying climate and security is a new policy. I'm saying it's a new prism. Because if we don't have that prism in all those different silos and connect them, we will be flying blind. So we're doing it, but I'm being very honest about it. It's not yet self-executing. It needs the tugboats, as we heard this morning. We're pushing and pulling. There is traction. You can see this increasingly also with our principals in their speeches. And let me do what I said this morning, the joint communication on our climate and energy vision, which is about boosting our competitiveness with our clean industrial deal. You will find in there, and I invite you to look it up, a defense paragraph which tries to make that connection between, hey, there's a transition ongoing, we want to be competitive, and we want to have a very strong deterrent and credible fighting force. For those reasons, we have to make those links. Now, we've said that, now we've got to do it. And I think the help of the experts from the military side could lead and help push that narrative. But again, please, not in silos together.
Maybe a very quick follow-up question. I mean, this idea of a prism, really moving beyond silos, is extremely important. And I think, again, awareness is there, but we lack implementation. Would you say, is it more a leadership question? Does it have to change at the top? Or is it a bottom-up question informing everyone within all the silos to slowly merge together?
Listen, it's always important that the political leadership embraces this, but it's not enough. So it's all of the above. As I said, it has to be embedded in the policy DNA, like overriding your software, so that people say, hey, if I talk about Sudan, or if I talk about the Sahel, or if I talk about other regions, there's a new box that says, hey, what are the climate pressures and environmental pressures there? What are the water stressors there? Just that you take it into account. It's not the only thing, but you need it part and parcel. Things are happening. I'm not saying nothing's happening, but it's not self-executing.
Thanks very much. I think we can dive deeper into this in the following rounds. I will move it to this side of the table. And Mathieu, you have worked at this intersection of climate and defense for quite a while, and I think you could also tell a story about the different silos that are or are not communicating. But you run Casco, as I said, as a center of excellence for NATO, but you're not NATO per se. So maybe you can use this precision a bit on, like the overview of the climate and defense file at the other international institution, NATO. How are we doing, and where do we stand?
Thank you. And we didn't do it on purpose, so NATO people on the left side and EU people on the right side. It just ended up like this. No, I'm very happy to be here to speak about this, I think, and I'm really welcome the fact that the Berlin Climate Security Conference is actually talking about the defense angle, because it's something very important. And when Tony was talking about silos, from my perspective, it's the military with the civilian world. You said the transition is ongoing on the civilian side. Well, the military needs to adjust to that as well. What I wanted to talk about specifically when we talk about readiness, for us, it's also a lot about resilience. And I think that, we use the word often, resilience, but not everyone knows what it means exactly and how it actually is unfolding in practice, but the military are pretty good at this, at preparing for events and responding to events, but also absorbing the impact of it and learning and adapting from it. I would say that the problem with climate security is that we have not felt the impact yet. But when we will, I'm confident the defense enterprise will adapt. However, and we heard this before, it's better to prepare than to have to deal with it when it happens and change on the fly. And that's why CASCO is there, right? It's to make sure that we understand better the challenges that are coming at us from different directions. We can talk about regional, but we also can talk about thematics challenges. You talked about and resilience is not only a military thing, it's a civilian thing, it's a political thing, it's a human thing. Geostrategically, I think we are showing a lot of resilience right now. We have seen the multilateral arena change significantly over the several years for security priorities taking the top of the priority list, but also social economic issues and trade issues. And we also see less predictability in our relationships with allies and adversaries alike. The fact that our interactions are more, I think, Janani talked about interest-based, I would say transactional rather than aspirational, is also something that is to take in consideration when we're dealing with our collective and collaborative way forward. But one thing I can say that is working for us in defense and climate is that despite all the things that could happen at the political and strategic level, the armed forces are always trying to be as effective in an operational environment as possible. And the environment is a big aspect of this. So, the military will always be open to hear how our environment is changing to make sure that they are prepared to face whatever comes at them in the best dispositions possible. So in that sense, despite maybe the different positions that we hear across allies, but also globally, I don't think that the focus has changed from a military perspective. Mm-hmm. The challenge now is how we make all the good work that we do, all the shared truths that we will develop, the science that we're basing our advice on, how do we make sure that this is injected in the decision-making process of defense key decision makers, but also military leadership? Mm.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I think we can actually really dig a bit deeper and stay on this side of the table. And Mona, I would like to take it to you in how do we integrate climate thinking into military thinking? I mean, Mathieu just spoke about leadership, but there are also projects working on the ground, and you have led quite some files within the IMS trying to streamline climate considerations into military and security policy. So maybe you could share a bit of the progress you have seen there over the current years, where we stand at the moment, and also how your files interact with NATO's current priorities.
Thank you so much, Ronja. And similar to Mathieu, let me also say I'm very glad that we have a defense panel once again at this BCSC, and that NATO is for the third time in a row part of it. You also at the beginning, when you started to introduce the session, you said that you want to move from awareness to practice and to implementation. And perhaps let me start with saying a couple of words on that as well, because as many of you know, NATO has a climate change and security agenda, which forms the policy base of the work which NATO is doing, in addition to decade-long work NATO has been doing on environmental protection, which is deeply integrated in our military chain of command. But then, of course, NATO is a political military alliance, and we very much need to focus on the NATO military command structure as the backbone of NATO when we talk about implementation and operationalization of the agenda. And just to do a little bit of, let's say, NATO one-on-one here, is the body I'm working for, the International Military Staff, is the executive body to the military committee, which again forms the entry point to the NATO command structure, so to our Allied Command Operations, also known as SHAPE, to our Allied Command transformation, and then to the Joint Force Commands, the component commands, whether it's MARCOM, AIRCOM, LANDCOM, so really focusing on specific domains, and then of course our NATO force structure. And we need to make sure that we have all of them on board if we really want to implement what we are discussing on the policy level. And perhaps like putting that a bit more into a military perspective, for us it is maybe not always so important, and it might help us in this kind of political climate on why the climate is changing, but we need to address and we need to adapt to the consequences, because above all we must maintain our military strength and our operational effectiveness. And in order to do that, we work very closely with the command structure. Another point you've been raising earlier was, do we need to do that top-down or bottom-up? And for me, I mean, classically, when we speak with the military, it is top-down. We start on the strategic level, and that's also where I'm working at the International Military Staff. But, and I would say a lot of the policy considerations have arrived with us, and we're starting to implement. But then I think, particularly on that file, it is very important to also look towards the tactical level, because it's actually those with boots on the ground who see the consequences first. When I speak to my colleagues in NATO mission Iraq, but also to those in Kosovo, myself, I was deployed to Afghanistan, I made the same observations there as well, then very often you do see consequences. For example, when you're grounded for days because your helicopters cannot take off, when your armored vehicles are starting to fail. You have so many really practical implications, or when simply, I mean, in NATO mission Iraq, I think the latest numbers I heard was 85% of the energy is on air conditioning. And when you have 50 degrees in summer and you're standing somewhere in a guarding town as part of our force protection, that's not funny anymore, particularly not if you have a uniform and protective armor on you, and it's simply not doable. So, and those lessons learned from the tactical level, we need to bring up to the strategic level. And at the same time, of course, we need to bring it down from the strategic through the operational. And I think that's where we have most work still to do, down to the tactical level. So perhaps leaving it for that moment.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Patrick, thank you for being very patient with your time. And maybe we can also stick a bit to the more concrete level, and Mona outlined some of the policies that have been shaped at NATO, but also the EU. Oh, my microphone is blinking. I don't know if this has anything to say.
Maybe mine's on.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to make sure that the people online can hear me, but okay. Sorry. So we spoke about NATO, but let's take it to the EU. The EU is not the first actor that comes to mind when you talk about security and defense, but it's actually been very active in recent years. And also, as I mentioned in my introduction, on the climate and security front, and the joint communication of 23 outlined quite a number of tasks and deliverables, the CSDP climate package, and I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with that, so maybe we can start by just introducing this package and also the state of affairs in that regard.
Okay, thank you, Ronja. Vielen Dank. And I'm not just surprised that we are just separated, because in fact we are doing a lot of things together with NATO.
We should be in a circle.
Yeah, right. So it's just physically, but in this way we are doing a lot of things together with NATO, because €1 invested in NATO is the same euro invested in the 23 EU member states that are the European pillar of NATO. So we have to be very clever on what this euro could be fit for. So let me just talk about the climate package. And maybe that we will also have some further discussion on many details. But first, an immediate approach on this climate package is to deal with the current so-called common security and defense policies, missions and operations. So together with the civilian operation headquarters for the civilian missions, EUMS and the MPCC, EU military staff, military planning and conduct capabilities for the EU military side, we are implementing the nomination of environmental advisors and environmental focal points. So the idea is to increase the climate awareness and to build climate consciousness. it's really important because in the mindsets of our leadership, of course, they are more focused on the way their missions and operations are going on, but not really on the broader perspective. And in fact, when it's also something that it is for a long-term perspective as climate change. So it's really important. So next step is to get these people well educated and well trained. So it has to be done through the European Security and Defense College. I think maybe Esther is just there. He's the one leading this topic with the Climate Change Security and Defense Training Platform, and with the development of 2 courses, Climate Change and Security, and a new one, a pilot course, we are co-chairing about environmental management. So, and we hope to have this course, ready for 2026. And we hope that member states will apply for sending people to join this course. So, then we have also to do some exercises and to put the seeds of what is climate change and environmental issues into exercises. Military ones are the one integrated with NATO, for example, or with the civilian side. So, for example, I will participate in 2 weeks' time in Sweden to a tabletop exercise called Coherent Resilience Arctic 2025 in dealing with the protection of critical energy infrastructure, and which is against all threats, to include climate, of course. And with, for example, new routes due to the ice melting to the North Pole, right? So then we have access to NATO courses, and that's very good. I was 3 weeks ago with 2 other people from EU attending a NATO climate change and security course in Italy. Very interesting one. So then we have the collaboration with the EDA, the European Defense Agency, through the implementation of some projects like INDI, and I can develop it afterwards, and also the Consultation Forum for Sustainable Energy in the Defense and Security sector. And finally, through the Climate and Defense Network, which is a room where the member states are invited to participate, share best practices and knowledge. And as of today, 14 member states of 27 have already developed their own climate change and security strategy. And it's helped by and supported by the Joint Research Center, ISPRA, that Tony Hagota has already mentioned. And the idea is to support the network through research, analysis, and publications. So that's the climate package, so to say.
Perfect. Thank you very much for sharing this. And I think your points make clear 2 things at least. And the one is that the effects of climate change on defense really affect all levels. It's the strategic level. You mentioned the melting ice in the Arctic. It's the operational level, so how do we plan for CSDP missions and operations, but it's also the very tactical level. So it is really an encompassing challenge that is worked on at very many levels. And this is the second point. So we hear the EU has been pushing ahead on that front. So quite a lot of initiatives are going on. And maybe I would use this as a segue back to you, Tony, because we hear there is going on a lot, but perhaps the EU isn't quite there yet as a leader in this climate and defense sector. And you already mentioned some of the institutional challenges of breaking the silos, bringing the communities together. But you also mentioned in the opening panel today the joint communication on energy, where it was managed to bring in a defense part. So I think this is really a good practice example. So maybe we can, just to stick to these institutional questions for a moment, can talk about why did this happen? What's the success story behind in bridging the gap between the 2 communities, and how do we move ahead?
Well, anyone who has tried to surf on a board in the sea knows that you need to catch a wave. So you can have the best surfboard, you can be fully athletic and balanced. If you don't have the wave, you can't surf. I think we're on that wave now. So you say the EU is not a leader. I would question it. I think we are. I mean, if you look around the world, who else is having such a comprehensive transition policy? Who else is integrating so openly this in? There are some examples within the EU. I think Germany does a great job. The UK is also very ambitious in this area. We are going to devise a security and defense partnership with the UK. This nexus is going to be part and parcel of it. Canada, well, Mathieu can speak to this, but at Montreal, the defense minister of Canada, McGuinty, made a speech which blew me away. You can find it online. It's not Chatham House. I would invite everyone to go and look and read what he said. So I think we're doing quite a good job. I'm just, I'm always critical of ourselves that I think we can do better. You said top down or bottom up. Also, our system is the politics are devised by those who have that democratic mandate. That's not us. Nobody voted for me but once that is done, what I meant was it's not enough. So you need what Mona said, the feedback loop on the ground, like what works, what doesn't work. So that has to go. But also people have to, they have to do all that. In that joint communication, as I said, the time was right, but we had a NINISTO report about preparedness, though this goes even beyond defense. From that, we had a preparedness strategy in March this year, which is like, all-angle approach. There's a different word for it now, it eludes me, but an all-angle approach from cyber, from defense, from climate, you name it. So there's something growing in our awareness that we have to be resilient, and that requires an imagination to be able to imagine that something terrible could happen, even if it doesn't happen. You don't know if it happened, nobody can predict it, but that you at least have the preparation and put in your systems so that if it happens, you're well prepared.
Thanks very much. And maybe, Mathieu, bridging this gap from the CASCO perspective, what can an institution like CASCO do for overcoming these gaps, for breaking down the silos, and maybe some examples from your work there in Montreal?
Thank you. I was hoping to steal some of Tony's lines, but he stole mine.
Which was what? Oh, McGuinty.
Yeah.
Well, you could do it again.
I'll double down on this. I really want, and Tony is right, I think the speech that the minister made at the summit two weeks ago was groundbreaking in a lot of ways, and also showing the path moving forward. Maybe just a line from his speech that is quite telling when he talks about climate resilience, not just an environmental policy, but it's an operational policy because it affects our force readiness. And it's part of the national strategy of Canada as well. So, and there's plenty of great nuggets in that speech, just like this one. At CASCO, our aim is really to support national defense institutions and NATO in developing advice on climate change, and not at the policy level. We're not a policy shop. We're not an advocacy shop. We're really an operational center of excellence like the other NATO COEs out there, and we're 30. And our focus is really on 4 pillars, if you may. One of them is research analysis, obviously, but we don't do this alone, and that answers one of your questions. We have to do it through a network. Very great work has been done on climate security within this crowd, but also in think tank world, in academic world, and in national governments. And our aim is to make sure that these efforts are not duplicative, and people are actually aware of what's being done elsewhere. And then take the best of it and shape it for supporting decision-making within our defense institutions and at NATO. The second one, and I think we talked already about this from a EU perspective, training and education from our end is very important, not only because it's a great way of raising awareness within the military and the defense practitioners, but also because it helps spreading the good practices, and Mona talked about the operational and tactical aspects. Well, this knowledge is very important for us to be able to train the largest a number of men and women in uniform. And that doesn't mean that they need to know everything and anything about climate change, but they need to know the impact that climate has on their job and their day-to-day activities when they're on operations. The third pillar is doctrine revision and support. So NATO has a lot of doctrines, so do national defense institutions. And because of the nature of the topic, a cross-sectoral nature of climate security, we are called upon to review a lot of these doctrines and make sure that we inject this aspect into the doctrine review process. And that goes back to the discussion about stovepiping. We shouldn't be stovepiping climate. It shouldn't be a
Stovepiping.
Stovepiping.
Okay. Silos, yeah.
Stovepiping, silos, yeah.
It's a word.
That's a good word.
It shouldn't be the case, right? Because it should be injected in pretty much everything we do. That doesn't mean it has to be the priority of everything we do, but it needs to be understood. And then finally, concept of operation, which is the way the military start planning their future deployments, which is also, from our perspective, very important, because then that's where we actually can change or shape the planner's vision of their environment. And I know we'll talk about the challenges later, but what I wanted to maybe highlight is that not all NATO allies, but certainly a lot of our sponsoring nations, we have 12 sponsoring nations, already have developed some key documents that relates to how they approach the challenge of climate change from an infrastructure perspective, from a personnel perspective, and from a platform perspective. Now the question is, how do you take that great policy work and transform it into reality? And I think that's the leitmotif of our discussion today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And we will get back to these specific examples of infrastructure, personnel, etc. I promised that. But I think, great points you made, and I think it's pretty obvious. You mentioned issues that Patrick mentioned, right? You mentioned the European Security and Defense College. We have a representative here that is working on education and training. You mentioned that so there is quite a big overlap. And as I have representatives from NATO and EU assembled here, I can't help to talk a bit about coherence and cooperation between the two institutions. And we know that at the political level, we know there are certain member states, certain allied states that have issues with that, and we won't solve them. But I would like to look at, on the ground, how are the institutions coming together? Are there any examples that we can share on how this cooperation works well? And maybe Mona and Patrick would have some thoughts from their practical experience with the one and the other institution. Mona, would you like to start on that, maybe?
Sure, and I think there is a very practical example, because actually today Patrick's colleagues from the EU military staff and my colleagues from international military staff are meeting in Brussels at the annual roundtable, where our two bodies are coming together and climate change and security is on the agenda. And just this Friday, we also have a discussion between EU and NATO on environmental security. So, but those are two examples which are happening in 1 week, but we have so many more. And I think on a staff-to-staff level, whether it is the purely military bodies, but then, of course, also on the policy side, there is so much cooperation happening. And I think it's really about complementing each other's work, because, we do have our advantages, both have our I would say added value which we bring to the table. We don't have, for example, legislative power. We cannot put regulations on member states. The EU can. But then what we can do with regards to working on interoperability between our NATO members or on standard setting, that's work which we can push forward. So I think it's really seeing where we can bring our basically added value to the table, and work together very closely. But perhaps, Patrick, you want to jump in on that?
So just before going on, I just want to mention, before being posted to Brussels, I've been 7 years occupying a position in the NATO side. So I'm perfectly aware of what is NATO. And I was already involved in the NATO Environmental Protection Working Group, for example. So I'm there. Then very glad to be invited as EU representative to the NATO Environmental Protection Working Group. And within this working group, we exchange, for example, I have asked for having the possibility to use the STANAGs, the standard agreements, that NATO is very good in doing standards, EU is very good in making rules and policy. So it's complementary. You're right. And there is a lot to do together, because it's all about bringing our workforce together, not doing things separately. So there are other examples. I mentioned the India project. It's a project that is meant to analyze the situation on how to find alternatives to fossil fuels energies. So there are renewable energies, there are nuclear energy, you have gas, and you have hydrogen, for example. So, but there is the like the equivalent from the NATO side, and it's a Science for Peace program called G7933. Sorry for this, but it's very NATO thing of things, and it's about how to measure the consumption in a military camp, like 1,000 people camps, and how we can reduce and be more effective in the way we use energy, because we have to be realistic. In the years to come, there will be more energy demand all over the world, so also for the military. If we include the AI, if we include, high velocity, weapons, will be a huge demand on energy. So these examples highlight the fact that we need real cooperation. I have another one example is about energy. I'm currently working on staff-to-staff discussion, very, very deep discussions on the energy, and specifically the use of ESAF, sustainable aviation fuel. So behind there is like a huge dilemma, because we have a need in the military. We are very pragmatic, realistic. We have to achieve the mission we are assigned to. Okay? So we need to have the most, operational effectiveness as we need to achieve this, the mission. So if we have to run with fossil fuels, we need fossil fuels stocks enough before we transition to something else. So that's quite a dilemma, because we have to store a lot of fossil fuels when we are just implementing, projects and programs to get rid of the fossil fuels. So that it's a very important issue to solve. So we have to work together, specifically in the European continent, with NATO in this side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Those are very good examples of how cooperation is happening and needs to happen on the ground. Tony, you had a quick point on that?
Because I think to summarize, because I don't think I've been very clear, not clear enough. So when it comes to fossil fuels, the numbers that I read somewhere is that in 1945 you needed 1 liter of gasoline per soldier. In 2020 in Afghanistan, that was already about 20 to 25 liters. The cost of that liter of gasoline at a retail pump is what? Let's say €2 average. But to bring it onto a base is almost 40 euros. And then you need 7 liters of gasoline to project that 1 liter to the, so there, and then don't forget the people dying in those convoys. So there are reasons why you want to get rid of that if as much as you can. So it's one thing for the military to be resilient for hurricanes that destroy your base and adapt. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, I don't know if I can say lethality or effectiveness. You want to fight and win wars if it comes to that, or be a credible deterrent, which means you have to be able to fight and win wars. That's from the military side. But there is also, in the EU at least, extremely strong a priority of being competitive in a world that's going electric. And so that competitiveness part and the military effectiveness part, they are wonderfully to be putting together. So the internet, the pen, all these dual-use technologies, things that innovation that came from this is so important. So I wanted to put these two together. The innovation and the competitiveness part is part and parcel of the security part.
Yeah, very important. I think that's very clear, and it showcases also how this initial idea that I mentioned, climate resilience as a building block also of military effectiveness and defense readiness, and I think we circle back to that. And to make it a bit more concrete, I thought we'll use the last round for like specific examples. So when we talk about climate resilience and armed forces, the themes that usually come to the floor, and many have been mentioned already, are personnel, they are material, they are infrastructure, they are perhaps doctrine, and maybe we can speak a bit to these. Mathieu, I would like to start with you in that, and this is the last round, so you get your questions and comments ready by now, okay? So, Mathieu, from a Casco perspective and the issues that I mentioned, what's on top of your mind, and what are you working on? How do we move forward very specifically in the field?
Well, you know, we're a young organization, but the main project we have right now, obviously, is looking towards the Arctic, and I can say there's plenty of real, tangible, you know, actual examples of some of the challenges that we face. You know, we all learned about the global warming and the fact that the Arctic is warming up faster than the rest of the planet, but that in itself is not only creating opportunities, it creates challenges, it creates new operating environment where not only the military but also the civilians and also the law enforcement agencies are struggling because all of a sudden you have you know, a pattern that you thought was a permanent state of things that changes significantly. You have icebergs that breaks and change the pattern, and the unpredictability of sea state is something that is a reality, a growing reality. In Canada specifically, you know, a big part of the year we use the extreme climate as a logistical support. So, you know, winter roads are something that are very important to replenish the communities that are living far north, and we can't count on this anymore. So that means more flights. But then again, you know, the runways are being affected by the change of temperature. So that means more investment in infrastructure. Not only that, but in Canada specifically, but also elsewhere in Europe, forest fires are changing the role and the responsibilities of the armed forces. You know, as much as they don't see themselves as first responders, they're being called as such. It has an impact on, we talked about readiness, we talked about resiliency, we talk about the wear and tear on the platforms, but also the people. So all of these are real examples that are not like, it's not a forecasting exercise. It's happening right now, and we see the impact of it. One of the problems that we see as well from our side is we're paying for years of underspending in the military. And when we talk about resilience, when we talk about adaptation, when we talk about readiness, that has a big toll on it. You know, the reduced availability of platforms, the reduced efficiency of platforms is something that is impeding our ability to conduct our mission. We cannot adapt, and we talked about the different sources of energy. Well, these platforms that we have that are old are only working on one source of energy, and that's not the way things will evolve in the future. And then there's the increased vulnerability of it all, and Tony talked about the human cost of some of the logistical challenges. So all these things, I think, need to be understood and taken to practice because, you know, we're at a crossroad. I'm not sure we're perfectly aligned, but the significant increase in defense spending combined with technological advancement in alternative source of fuels and also in protective wear for soldiers, you know, I would say we're maybe 10 years early, but, you know, we don't have time to do this. But I hope certainly that, and this is the job of Casco as well, is to make sure that the advice when it comes to investing the billions that we're about to inject in the defense industry are actually thinking about how this platform will operate in 40, 50, 60 years. It needs to be part of the equation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of us here are working on that to make this a reality. And I mean, you mentioned the sort of the changes in the Arctic, the very strategic level. You mentioned the tactical level. Patrick, I would like to bring you in here. You're a civil engineer. Logistics and infrastructure is really at the backbone of every military operation. And I know you were a blue helmet in Lebanon. You work in Afghanistan. Maybe also from your experiences in the field, how do you feel climate effects working out, and what can we do to mitigate against this when it comes to infrastructure logistics?
Yes, it's kind of a very challenging issue, because we have to be very ready and to be very prepared to go very urgently in some area in the world where there is a crisis happening. And then we have to be very quickly efficient. So we need to run with the energy we have currently. So it's very difficult to really go to switch from this, really available energy to the one more green, if I should say. But it is something we are, in many EU and NATO countries, there are a lot of developments currently in using more and more renewable energies, because it's really efficient in some specific circumstances. So we have to be very adaptive on where we can use this, way to transition from fossil fuels, where it is the best suited. So then, for example, if you go for, as a really civil engineer, you go for energy, it's crazy, because a fossil fuel engine, the efficiency is 43%. So that means 57% of the energy you use is wasted. So it's crazy if you think about this. So we have to really deal with this, because also for the military defense budget, it's not extensive. We have to deal with what the government offers. So we have to be very pragmatic, very practical, and go for very usable, and we have to really deeply get involved in a dual-use things, and to get the €1 invested in the defense as a burden sharing with something developed in the industry side for the civilian side.
Yeah.
So that's very important.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, very important point. Final question goes to Mona. And what we spoke about material, the infrastructure now a bit, but not so much about the people, the soldiers that are executing the missions on the ground. And they're also exposed to a changing environment. They need to be prepared for this, and maybe you can share some ideas on how you're working on preparing the people, on planning, on education, on planning the exercises, etc.
Sure. Very happy to come in here, and also perhaps linking that back to sometimes, like in our discussions, the topic of training already came up, and of course that's very important for us. We just conducted a training course in Italy together with Casco and together with the NATO Science and Technology organizations, and we were very glad that also colleagues from the EU and the German Ministry of Defense were present there. But of course, we also need to move that beyond training and need to go to exercises, because we need to see if what we are training for is actually working in practice, and we need to identify gaps and see what do we still need to work on. And that's what we started at NATO 2 years ago, when we integrated climate change and security considerations into our biggest decision-making exercise, which takes place each 2 years, as well as this year in our biggest emergency management exercise. And we very much believe there also in a kind of mainstreaming perspective, because holding an exercise alone on climate change and security won't bring us there, and will also not catch the attention we need, because at the moment, to be very real, whatever does not talk about deterrence and defense is not going to be in the spotlight. So we need to connect it to that. And so we very much integrate climate change and security considerations into what we are already doing. And we do that through 3 key themes. On the one side, we're looking at the tactical and operational effects of weather temperature extremes in a specific operational context. So, for example, the impact of specific environmental hazards on military capabilities and facilities, including our bases and infrastructure. And to give you a concrete example here, I could mention our reinforcement corridors. What happens if within our reinforcement corridors, flooding is impairing the movement of military vehicles, and we basically do not get our personnel to the front? It has a very concrete impact on our deterrence and defense structure. But then also and I've spoken about that earlier, when extreme heat or dust is impacting the lifting capacity of our helicopters, of our armored vehicles, and so on. And then, of course, very specialized capabilities, such as CBRN. Everybody who has ever in a kind of training worn a CBRN suit knows that this is tough in 20 degrees, but in like 40 or 50 degrees, it's impossible. And then I think the kind of second lens we're looking at here is the impact on availability and prioritization of forces. We've spoken about, I think, wildfires, and my Canadian colleague can very much speak about that as well. And even though the military might not want to be seen, and that very much depends also on the national context, on the structures we have in place, so much as a first responder, I mean, the reality is we are moving from an if the military intervenes to when and how. And we had numerous examples. I mentioned Canada, but also here in Europe, last year in Poland, when I think about Operation Phoenix, which involved over 26,000 Polish soldiers, and also Germany was supporting, actually, with sending military engineers over. And of course, this personnel, which is involved on disaster response, is not available for the deterrence and defense posture, which we have at NATO. So I think that very much also comes up here. And then the last kind of lens we are taking, and that takes us from a purely military to also a military-civilian perspective, is the long-term strain posed by climate change on enablement and resilience, because it also puts at risk the ability of the civilian sector to support and enable the military. At NATO, we have the 7 baseline requirements on resilience, and that comes like very often in civil military cooperation, we speak about the military supporting the civilian side, but it also goes the other way around. And the civilian sector also supporting the military, because we don't grow our own food, to give you one example. So food and water security is one of our baseline requirements, but then also secure communications, continuity of government, the ability to deal with mass movements and uncontrolled movements of people, and so on. And that needs to be in place, and I think I don't need to explain how these categories are being impacted by climate change. You're all experts on the subject, but that's also something we need to take into account in our exercises and prepare for that.
Great, thank you very much. So now I will give it back to the panel in a minute, but I want to make sure that we can integrate some questions also from the room here. I saw one already, but are there other people who would like to speak? If they're from the second row, you will have to move to the table and use one of the microphones. And is that a...
No, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
The one thing I want to say is 2 mic can be read together, but if there's a third one, then the live people won't hear you. So make sure.
Okay, so make sure to switch it off after you ask your questions. I will start with the gentleman here. Please introduce yourself very quickly and make sure your question is an actual question with a question mark in the end and not a lengthy co-statement.
Yeah, thanks. I know the drill. I'm Luc Bas. I'm the director of a new climate risk assessment center in Belgium. And I'm not going to say too much about that, because otherwise I don't get to that question mark. But we have a special mandate to advise our National Security Council. So I'm here actually to learn and to translate what I'm hearing also back to them from the assessment that we're doing, and we're launching at 6th of November. What I wanted to say is, or to get also some inspiration on, is how we're going to explain those dual use elements in the budgets at the national level that need to be spent now. Also to comply with the national resilience plans in the baseline requirements from NATO. So what do we need to tell our national governments to make sure that we can, I know I'm going to use the words that were said, to surf on a wave of military spending that can have this dual purpose. And I also wanted to say that the focus on adaptation is also incredibly important. We talk about fossil-free energy security, that remains important, but we're lagging really on the actual resilience in the environment, in our infrastructure. There's hardly anything happening, and this is an opportunity to accelerate, because adaptation funding is unfortunately in Belgium, in Europe, and also globally at a very low burner. So this is an opportunity, and how would you see that, or how should we translate that to our ministries at the national level?
Thanks, that's very clear. I'll pool a few questions. Maybe you can go next.
Can you hear me? Yes. Sorry, it's an awkward angle. So current defence procurement decisions will realistically be locking us into fossil fuel use for probably the next 30 to 50 years. And at the same time, across EU policy, we see defence exemptions across a lot of environmental and climate policy. How do we bring defence into the Green Deal and the transition? We've heard use of dual-use technologies and sustainable aviation fuels, which are obviously critical, but the progress isn't happening anywhere near as quickly, and I would argue that I think the defence industry takes its hint from government policy. But with all of these exemptions, how does this reflect on the progress that is being made, and how do we counteract that? And also a very quick point as well around, I think I heard correctly that NATO is less interested in why the climate is changing, but how to respond, which I do understand. But I think given that global militaries are responsible for an estimated 5.5% of emissions, I think we do actually have to dig into what these sources are if we are to meet our climate policy targets. Thank you.
Also, thank you. And maybe can you just let us know your name and your affiliation?
Yeah, sorry, hi. Ellie Kinney from the Conflict and Environment Observatory.
Perfect, thank you very much. I saw another question over here.
Thank you, and thank you very much for some really interesting interventions and points made. I would actually like to take the opportunity to flag a German innovation that we've been very inspired by. I come from Concito, a climate think tank located in Denmark. Germany, at the Munich Security Conference, launched its first interdisciplinary climate risk assessment as an input to national security. And I believe that that is extremely interesting because it was done between adelphi and other, climate and foreign and security policy institutions and the Federal Intelligence Service, which is, in my view, a hugely important innovation. And what is really key here is that how do we get climate issues integrated into decision making? It's really based on what is the risk picture or the threat picture provided by our intelligence services for Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And therefore, I think the German model that cuts across the civilian and the military spheres highlights the importance both to the civilian and military sphere of critical infrastructure and all the services provided, energy, water, food, health, what have you. And cuts across also in national, regional, and international level is really, really key as a starting point for integrating some of this thinking. And it's very clear from that analysis that it's not classified what it takes to in terms also of collaboration between different communities. So I would just like to flag that.
Lunch break, so make sure you ask the questions you still have in mind to the speakers. And then we will do a quick round. I'm sorry I'm stealing a bit of time from the lunch break, but we started a little late, so maybe you could give me 3 more minutes for the final round. Kira Finke.
Hi, thank you. Sorry for hiding behind you. Kira Finke, Head of Center for Climate and Foreign Policy at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Very quick comment. It would be great to learn from Belgium on how you advise the National Security Council, because this is currently lacking in our setup on the National Security Council in Germany regarding climate information. I wanted to, however, ask my question on the Arctic issue, maybe back to you or if somebody else wants to take it up. How should the Arctic Command be developed in the future? Do we need further reinforcement? Do we need a higher number of troops in the Arctic? Do we need more surveillance capacities as the northern routes are becoming more accessible. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think all of them were very interesting and well-informed questions, so I was right. There are experts in the audience too. I'll propose we go in reverse order. So Patrick, Mona, Mathieu, and Tony, reverse from the very first round of questions. Short answers and pick whoever you would like to speak to, so not everybody has to cover everything.
Sorry. So with regards to the defense exemptions, I don't know exactly what you mean by defense exemptions, but I don't see that there is exemptions. I see that there is very pragmatic things that we have to deal with, but I mean, at least for the French defense, I will speak of this. There is no exemption. We have to go to be exemplar, and we have, France has developed the climate change strategy, and we have to go and follow this strategy because it's something that is at stake. I mean, it's our future. It's not something that the military are just away from what exists today. They are also citizens, and they are, I mean, really deeply also involved in the way we have to be exemplar. So I think there is no, to me, it's just my opinion, no exemptions, and even more. We have to be, I mean, probably in a certain way in the lead, given the geopolitical context. We have to lead this. So the thing is, when you look about the EU readiness and the Rearm Europe to 2030, it's about 800 million euro. So how much of this, I mean, money can be driven to address the climate change, adaptation and mitigation, I mean, issues? That's the main challenge we have to face as military, because we have a lot to do, of course, with capability development, new assets of equipments, which are capable of being used for, I mean, transitioning energy, right?
Thank you. Over to Mona.
Thanks so much, and I will focus on the question which was posed directly to me on military emissions. Just to be very clear here, I've been focusing more on the adaptation work NATO is doing, but of course that does not mean that we should not look at our own emissions as well, and that's what we are doing as well. But the kind of angle we decided to take on the military side of NATO, focusing more on what are the direct implications we need to adapt to, rather than why the climate is changing, is that if I speak to troops on the ground and I tell them to save the climate, they're going to laugh about me, and I'm going to be out of the room. If we do anything which might endanger some of them to bring their soldiers back home, or going to compromise on military effectiveness, it's going to be out of the picture. So I think that's very important to take into account from the beginning. That does not mean that we do not need to bring in changes, and we do already, and we do have set goals as NATO. So we have made the commitment that NATO, and very much focusing here on NATO installations and facilities, reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030 and becomes down to 0% in 2050. And we have already published 2 years ago at our summit a methodology on how we are mapping that, and we have been conducting an energy audit to move forward on that. And I think here also innovation plays a huge role, and my colleagues from the EU have been hinting to that before, and mentioned the Science for Peace and Security program, which we have at NATO. I also want to mention here the NATO Innovation Fund, but also the DIANA, so the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, which works very closely also with defense industry to bring that forward. And as part of our defense innovation section, we also work closely with the Conference of National Armament Directors in order to bring in new standards on it, and we're developing multinational high visibility projects, which are focusing particularly on the linkage between energy and climate security. And perhaps lastly, there's on one side there's internal communication, but then on the other side, I mean, we also need to take into account that the staff at NATO are not the decision makers. It's ultimately its allies who are making the decisions. And we're consensus-based, and we serve all of our allies. So I think it's sometimes also about finding ways to continue our important work on that file, while having everybody on board.
Thank you, very important. Matthew.
Okay, I'll do a rapid fire, try to answer the questions.
Yes.
Dual use, absolutely, I agree, but I think the responsibility lies as much in defense institutions than other government institutions as well. For example, the Canadian Space Agency is providing dual use capacity, and they have to convince the defense institutions that their product's actually responding to their needs. So, you know, it's all a government responsibility. Fossil fuels, there's really two platforms that are really the big polluters in defense. It's the ships and the aircrafts. So, you know, we talked about SAF, but there's also different alternative ways of propulsing the ships, and that's what you'll see evolving. And I can tell you, like the Dutch-Belgian fleet, the requirements for new ships is making sure that the engines are dual fuel, so they can use heavy fuel, but they can also use other things like methanol. So that's what we see coming out. The industry is thinking about it, I think, very much so, and I don't know if it's for altruist reasons, but ultimately they are looking into this kind of new technologies because they know that, you know, in 20 years that's where the focus will be. Absolutely, on climate intelligence, I can't agree more with you. I think this is where it started. The intelligence community was the first one to identify climate as being one of a major threat, and that's what really snowballed into what we have right now. So Nike is great, and we should do more of that. Now on the Arctic, you know, yes to all the things, and in Canada anyway, it's more surveillance, it's more investment in infrastructure, it's more troops, but it's also more communication with the civilian entities that are already there. And I'm thinking specifically, you know, obviously local communities that are doing the security on behalf of the armed forces and law enforcement agencies, but also Canadian Coast Guards who are opening the sea routes in the summer for commercial shipping, but also for military operations. So all this is very important. Obviously, in our case, it will be a massive investment over time, so we need to make good decisions on everything. Maybe one last point. For you, as you're not part of the defense community, but and I say that to everyone as well, careful about duplicative efforts. I think, you know, we're all here and we all think that, you know, climate security is on top of everyone's agenda, but it's not. So if we're doing all the same stuff in our own corners without talking to each other, then we're losing a good opportunity of pooling our resources and making a greater impact. Thank you.
Important part. Final wise words, Tony.
Well, final certainly, but you said 3 minutes, I have 2. No, I'm kidding. So, yeah, the point on exemptions, I think what you're pointing at is there are a number of exemptions in taxonomy and reporting and chemical waste, because ultimately a fighting force needs to be able to fight. So to a certain point I understand it. I also think, as being said around the table, it is very clear that for efficiency and effective reasons, as the world is going electric, the military will follow suit. The innovation that's happening in the commercial civilian side will find its way simply because it makes sense. I don't think ideology will win out there, and I think that's a good thing. I also agree with Mona. If you talk about this volatile geopolitical situation and you start by, hey, let's green the army, you lose the argument. It's so I am sure that if you become competitive, innovative, and you're strong in your effectiveness, that will lead to a completely new a platform which is going to be a lot more sustainable than it is today. One thing, please don't forget that we operate in a political context. Our citizens are now supporting and seeing enormous amounts of money poured into defense, and they will accept that to a certain extent for a certain time, because already in elections, in my country, there are discussions, oh, wait a minute, so we got some parties saying we got to take money away from healthcare. So it is crucial that whatever the defense industry does in its investments, that they keep in mind that there has to be a dividend for civilians along the way to keep that support, because you know how it is. As soon as there's no war, they said, "Oh, why do we spend it? We're safe." Yeah, well, there's a reason why we were safe, but the peace dividend is very easily eaten up. So there is an intrinsical necessity to make sure that whatever you do in defense ultimately benefits society as a whole.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone for joining us in this discussion. Thank you to the panelists for sharing their thoughts. I think we answered quite some questions, but we also raised a lot of new questions. But I think this conversation was actually an exercise in bringing together different communities and linking climate security and defense. Sorry for eating into everyone's lunch break, but enjoy the break and make sure to be back in the big room at 2 o'clock for the next plenary sessions. Have a great day.